And we're continuing with the 5th chapter of Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. The name of the chapter is Nocturne. Miss Leonis sat in front of the dying embers of the fire. Her hand dangled loosely. It should have been fondling Boz's ear, but she had buried Boz that afternoon, managing with extreme difficulty to dig a shallow hole. She could not lift the old dog to carry him to the grave. Despite the gauntness of age, he was still too heavy for her. So she dragged him, apologizing for the indignity, until she could push him into the waiting triangle, barely big enough, and cover his ancient bones with the loose dirt. Now she was exhausted. She had been too tired to eat. She was too tired to make the effort of taking off her clothes and preparing for bed. A thought fleetingly passed across her mind. If Simon should need me, I'm free to go to him without worrying about finding someone to take care of old Boz. She tried to shake the thought away, but it would not go. Her empty hand reached for a letter of Quentin's, which she had read earlier that day. I am anguished, dearest mamma, at the plight of the poor deal in this beleaguered country, and our wounded soldiers die of infection or exposure, because there is no way to care for them. Manuela, and I do have an eye for beautiful women, mamma, is giving me jewels with which to buy ointments and bandages, but we must depend on generosity from the continent and England for a great deal. Could you turn your kind heart to our predicament? You will know what we most need, quinine, of course. But you will know what else. And I have a flair for tending wounded men. Had I not been your youngest son, I might have been a physician. This was the Quentin Miss Leonis knew and loved and understood, even the reference to the unknown. Manuela was, in this context, understandable. This was the Quentin she had taught Simon to revere. And she had been wrong. The next letter held cold comfort. Forgive me, dearest mamma, for the long delay in writing, and if my script is somewhat shaky. I have had an adventure, which nearly proved fatal. Somewhat over a month ago, I was out in the jungle hunting. I had strayed slightly from my companions, and suddenly I heard a horrid rattling, and my horse bolted. He is a spirited but nervy creature, and it was some time before I could claim him. And by then I was thoroughly lost. I tried to guide myself by shadows and sun, but evidently misjudged most woefully, and by nightfall I had to admit to myself that I was indeed in a plight. I will spare you details, but I survived in solitude and mounting distress for several days, eating roots and berries and drinking water from various streams. Whether from water or from insect bites, I do not know, but I fell violently ill of an ague. The time came when I knew that I was dying, and I could do naught but welcome death, though I felt sore alone and near to weeping. Then in my delirium I felt that you were with me, your cool hand on my fevered brow. You held my head up and put water to my lips, and I opened my eyes and looked into eyes of black flame instead of cool gray water like yours. Somehow or other I had been transported to a small round dwelling, smelling sweetly of fresh grass and flowers. I learned when I was stronger that I had been found by a small party of hunters from the Quistano village, found just in time. The letter contained detailed descriptions of the Quistano village, and then Quentin wrote, "Oh, mamma, what a gift for caring the Quistanos have in their hands. I was brought back from the very doors of death. Umara says that healing is the gift of the tribe." The letter which followed dealt impersonally with politics and battles, and had only a parenthesis mentioning a few days spent resting with the Quistanos because of a brief return of the fever. Then, "Oh, my mother, how I am torn. I never would have believed that my heart could thus be rent in two. Manuela is ever dear to me, and her father, it seems, begins to look on me kindly. It would be an alliance most suitable, and you and Papa would approve. And yet, my little Quistana is deep within my heart. We have a dream of making a place where the wounded can be brought and nursed by these gentle people, who in no way deserve the name of savage." And then, "Am I fickle by nature? I would never have believed so. I love Manuela, not one whit less. I never believed it possible to love two people simultaneously, but I find that it is so. I adore my little Umara, who brings healing in her small and beautiful hands. Wearily, Miss Leonis let the letters fall from her hand, but her tired mind kept worrying, like old Boz with a bone, over what she had learned. The Quistano gift for healing was widely known throughout the peninsula. Indians of other tribes, even some Creoles, brought their injured or desperately ill people to Dragon Lake for healing. The young Englishman was deeply impressed by this vocation, and promised in his gratitude to provide the Indians with money if any of them wished to be trained as physicians. This was a promise he was quite capable of fulfilling, for he received jewels not only from Manuela, as Bolivar's victorious forces moved triumphantly through liberated towns and villages. The general and his officers were greeted not only with flowers, speeches, and songs of welcome, but with jewels, with gold. And Quentin Farr happily received his full share, that being the way of the world. As the liberation of the continent continued, he amassed considerable treasure. Manuela, whoever she was, became betrothed to a fellow officer, and Quentin's conscience was relieved. By now, his infatuation with the Indian princess outweighed all else. It became his intention to leave his treasure with he called Umara his wife, but as far as Miss Leonis could gather, they were not married, at least not in any way that would be considered binding in an English court. Not long after this, there was a bitter entry in his journal. Why do I tend to idolize and then get disenchanted? Idolize might be the better word for me to use against myself. It is not my Umara. She is still as lovely and as pure and as good as when I first brought her back to life, as when I was first brought back to life by her tender hands. But I tried to believe that all the Cristanos were like my Umara, that they were indeed the noble savage. And that is true of some of them, perhaps the majority. But of this I am no longer sure. Others, Umara's favorite brother is one, have little patience with the gift of healing, and are deeply involved in smuggling. Not that I blame them. They have no reason whatsoever to be loyal to Spain, and they have every reason to ignore Spanish prohibitions against foreign trade. So it is natural for them to be an important link in the chain of smuggling luxury goods, which would be prohibitive otherwise. All this I understand, but they do have cause for some loyalty to those of us who have been risking life and limb to set their country free, and they appear to care about us no whit more than they love Spain. I begin to doubt if they will really accept me when I come back from England, but I see no alternative. I wonder if I could take Umara and the child and live in Caracas, perhaps. But Umara did not want to leave Dragon Lake, and when Quentin left Venezuela for Kent, he expected to return in a few months, and then to remain with the Quistanos for the rest of his life. The bulk of his considerable accumulation of treasure would then be used for the education of his son, and though Quentin had decided, despite reservations, to cast his lot with Umara's people, he planned an English education for his son, and the contradiction implicit in this either had not occurred to him or did not disturb him. I thought I knew that all people were a mixture of good and bad, even the best, but I did not expect quite this amount of complication, Miss Leonis thought. Oh, Ninny Ann, what was it like for you? The discovery of the young Indian girl in Venezuela must have been a ghastly shock to the young bride in South Carolina, pregnant with her first child. Quentin had told her only that he had lived the typical life of a soldier of fortune, and that he was ready now to settle down and live like an ordinary citizen. Ninny Ann must have known that her husband's experience was as great as her own innocence, and he quickly made her sure and secure in his love. Few people in the pioneer South of those days would have thought twice about the rights of some South American Indian girl, even had they known about Umara. Stories like Quentin's were casually accepted and soon forgotten. Miss Leonis thought bitterly, and he must have had no suspicion that the past would have any effect on the present. Faro was built, and they were happy in their affairs prospered. If Umara had anything to do with Quentin's decision to free his slaves, he told no one. And if he had played free and easy with his loves in Venezuela, there was no indication in letters or journals that his love for Ninny Ann was anything but faithful and true. But it was, wasn't it, Ninny Ann? Miss Leonis asked. It was, but fidelity built on broken promises has a shaky foundation. One week, when the mail was delivered, Quentin was in Charleston. Ninny Ann sorted the mail and was wildly curious when she came upon an envelope addressed to Senora Ninny Ann St. Clair de Fer, an envelope mailed from Venezuela. It must be something to do with the portrait of Bolivar, which she was having sent from Caracas. So she opened the letter, suspecting nothing. But the letter was from one of Umara's brothers, and Ninny Ann's safe world of home and husband were shattered. With white face and cold hands and heart, she learned of Umara and of Quentin's promise to return to Dragon Lake. She learned that the Indian girl had died giving birth to a stillborn child conceived just before he left Venezuela, and his Quintano wife and little son. "This is to warn you," Umara's brother continued, you who took Umara from the heart of her husband, that we will not forget, and that we will be avenged when your so-called husband sent for his portrait of Bolivar, a portrait which rightfully belongs to his son. We made our plans. Know that you are much hated. It was you who made Quentin Fair betray his wife. We will not kill him. That would be too easy and small satisfaction to us. We understand that in your religion you are told that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children, even for 7 generations. Beware, you will find your sorrow, that for you this will be true. This letter has been put into English by Sean O'Connell of the Irish Regiment. Miss Leonis could feel within her own body the storm of sobs which racked Ninny Ann. Her love for Quentin and his for her must have been real indeed, that it had survived such an opening of the past, and that it continued despite horrible proof that Umara's brother had meant his threat. Quentin, and Ninny Ann's firstborn son, was thrown from his horse and died of a broken neck. He had been alone. There was no reason for anybody other than Ninny Ann and Quentin to suspect anything other than accident. They must have lived in terror, and there was nobody with whom they could share their fears. Of their 5 sons, only the 2 youngest survived. If Quentin had thought, when he left Venezuela, that a small fortune in jewels would satisfy Umara and her brothers, he learned that he was wrong. He had lived by the standards of another age, Miss Leonis thought, still acceptable by far too many people today, and those standards became a boomerang for his undoing. He died of a heart attack before he was 50. Ninny Ann lived to be nearly 99. They must have warned their surviving children, and surely the warning must have been passed from one generation of Fairs to the next. Perhaps at the time of the war between the states, fear of the revenge of the Quistanos had faded in view of what was going on at home, and then it seemed to have been forgotten. Perhaps those who were to carry the warning had been killed in battle. Certainly Miss Leonis's parents had not mentioned it, nor had there been any question when her only brother was killed while hunting by a gun accidentally set off, and perhaps she was overreacting, imagining things in her senility. No, there had been too many unexplained accidents. The family tree showed the untimely death of a young man in every generation. She began to pray. And that's the end of chapter 5.